I start?
Yes.
Okay. I want to thank the organizers of this huge conference for planning a session devoted to Pierangelo Garegnani. And in fact, this year, 2021, it is 10 years that Garegnani passed away. And I believe it is generally agreed among economists, regardless of their theoretical persuasions, that Garegnani made a fundamental contribution to the progress of economic theory. With his work, both critical and constructive, he greatly advanced the degree of theoretical development of several topics in the areas of economic analysis, and in particular in the reappraisal of the approach to the explanation of distribution of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, in supplementing that theory of distribution with an analysis of the levels of aggregate output based on the autonomy of demand, and in developing the criticism of neoclassical theory taken in its various formulations about the treatment of capital as a factor of production, which is found therein. Now, I leave the floor to my colleague Sergio LEVRERO, who specifically will deal with some of the fundamental issues with Garegnani worked about. Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you, Roberto. And we can say that there are two traits of the work of Garegnani that are traceable from his first contributions to economic theory, from his 1958 PhD thesis titled "The Problem in the Theory of Capital from Ricardo to Excel," to his work for Svimez in 1962, where Garegnani faced the issue of how to achieve high rates of growth in a case like that of Italy, which was characterized by large areas where labor underemployment was high. And these two traits are first the development of Sraffa's work, both on the side of the critique of the marginalist theory of value and distribution, and on that of the revival of the surplus approach of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and second, his attention to concrete economic phenomena. Of course, these two aspects are strictly interconnected because, for instance, the suggestion in favor of Keynesian economic policies could not but pass through a critique of the marginalist theory and the simultaneous clarification and development of an alternative theoretical approach. In the following, I'll give some hints regarding Garegnani's contribution to the capital debate and the critique of the neoclassical theory, his clarification of the analytical structure of the classical approach and the determinants of income distribution, and finally on his extension to the long run of the principle of effective demand. As regards Garegnani's work devoted to a critique of the consistency of the marginalist theory, he clarified, first of all, that an independent measurement of capital from distribution cannot be effected by means of single magnitude, but, I'm quoting Garegnani, only by a set of magnitudes, be they the physical quantities of the several capital goods of Varras or Sraffa, or the dated quantities of labor of Excel and Dimitriev. However, the marginalist theory needs to refer to capital as a single magnitude because, first of all, without a reduction of the different types of capital goods to a single magnitude, the substitutability between factors of production would be almost nil, since alternative production processes differ mainly in the kind of capital goods employed. And second, because the same fluidity of the capital endowment taken as the single magnitude is required to allow its physical composition adjusting in order to fulfill the condition of a uniform effective rate of return on the capital goods supplies. In dealing with the consequence for the marginalist theory of the impossibility to advance a consistent measurement of the quantity of capital independent of distribution, Garegnani looked at both the supply side and demand side of capital. As regards the side of the supply of capital, he showed that by introducing a value measurement of the existing social capital in order to fulfill the condition of a uniform rate of return, Wicksell, Clark, Marshall ended up reasoning in a cycle, since the value of capital depends on wages and profits, which are variables that capital should contribute to determining. On the contrary, the alternative of RAS, to take the endowments of the different kinds of capital goods as given, contrasts precisely with the condition of uniformity of the rate of return on capital, as advanced in Varra's theory of capitalization. As regards the side of the demand for capital, the capital debate of the 60s and 70s has shown the impossibility of determining univocal relations of the kind required by the marginalist theory between product per worker, capital per worker, and the rate of profits, due to the phenomena of reverse capital deepening and reswitching of techniques. And Garegnani stressed that this makes it impossible for the traditional version of the neoclassical theory of having unique and stable equilibria, hence impairing its validity. Garegnani maintained that these problems are also present in the more recent short-run neo-Varrasian version of the marginalist theory, where, following X value and capital, the logical inconsistency of Varras with respect to the determination of the long-run equilibrium characterized by a uniform rate of return on capital is overcome by silently dropping this condition. And in particular, in several papers, Garegnani argued that a saving investment market is implicit in this version, and there is indeed a strong reason behind Garegnani unceasing reference to and search for a saving investment market within the intertemporal equilibrium, namely to consider an economy which is not similar to an atemporal one, but which is a true capitalist economy, where the demand for future income is satisfied by whichever capital goods provide the highest return on their value. But the point is whether intertemporal models do or do not embody a saving investment market, and if they show paradoxical phenomena as those emerged in the capital debate concerning the old version of marginalist theory. This point, I mean, will be the content of Professor Fratini's seminar on the second stage of the capital debate. And here, two further elements can be stressed, however, in this respect. The first is that Garegnani emphasized that in this neo-Varrasian version of the general equilibrium, the equilibria cannot be centers of gravitation of the actual magnitudes, since the initial endowments of the different kinds of capital goods are taken as arbitrary givens, and thus they are bound to change quite quickly, depriving the equilibrium of its role as an attractor. This impermanence of the initial data entails that the theoretical variables that are there determined cannot be viewed as an average of the observable values over a period of time long enough to permit the fitful and short-lived phenomena to efface one another's influence through the repetition of the activities. And Garegnani stresses that this undermines the correspondence between theoretical and observable variables that is to be expected from any economic theory. The second point that can be stressed is that Garegnani results in the field of capital theory are still relevant with respect to the neoclassical macroeconomic theories, where the notion of capital as a single magnitude is still present. In neoclassical theory, the level of effective demand is adjusted to the one assuring full utilization of resources, via the price mechanism by the relationships between the factors supply and demand functions. Since the criticism to a well-behaved demand curve for capital is also a criticism to an inverse relationship between the rate of interest and the amount of investment, the basis for the neoclassical mechanism of adjustment towards full employment equilibrium disappears. And so, without any need to refer to liquidity preference, sticky money wages, and other short-run imperfections in order to deny a tendency of the rate of interest towards a level guaranteeing full employment, Garegnani is able to show on this ground that no automatic tendency to full employment exists in the market economies, since a fall in the rate of interest does not necessarily bring about a rise in the amount of investment. And with this, we are in the reconstructive parts of Garegnani's work, where he made an essential contribution, we can say, to the revival of the surplus approach by clarifying, first of all, the analytical structure of the classical theory, where the rate of profits and relative prices are determined in terms of three groups of data, that is, the real wage rate, the gross outputs of the various commodities, and the technical condition of production, and where we find a separate determination of prices and output. And second, Garegnani clarify how to extend the principle of effective demand to the long run. I will advance in this last part of my presentation some remarks on this last point, and then on Garegnani's suggestions about the determinants of income distribution. In Smith and Ricardo, since the wage rate was not determined by means of labor demand and supply curves, the social product was able to be determined before and separately from the rate of profits. In particular, for Smith and Ricardo, savings were investment and demand is only limited by production. So accumulation and technique were sufficient to determine the normal level of output at any particular time. Well, but once the inadequacy of Ricardo's position is recognized, the separate determination of prices and output that characterizes the surplus approach opens the way to the role of the effective demand to determine normal outputs. And Garegnani's contributions in this field is twofold. First, he clarified the object of a long-run theory of output in a classical Keynesian framework. And second, he specified the way by which aggregated demand can shape capital accumulation. Garegnani, looking at the first point, Garegnani stresses that whereas there is no reason to expect short-run output fluctuations around the full employment level, as in the neoclassical theory, this does not mean that there is no normal long period level of employment around which the short period levels fluctuate. According to Garegnani, this normal level will be the path traced by the sequence of short period equilibria, namely the path of short period equilibria is the moving long period position. Indeed, he wrote, production and employment occur always instant by instant in the actual economy, and therefore in the context of neither a short period nor a long period, since both contexts are a matter of theory and refer therefore to normal and not to actual levels of the variables, to centers of gravitation for the actual magnitudes and not to the actual magnitudes themselves. So Garegnani.
Sorry to interrupt you, Sergio. You have 6-7 minutes left in order to leave some time for questions.
So Garegnani specifies there are two centers of gravitation that distinguish themselves for the time involved. The short period equilibrium refers to a period too short for productive capacity to change appreciably, whereas the long-run equilibrium to a period in which productive equipment can change. Of course, Smith's metaphor of gravitation may be less telling when the central magnitude is less exactly determined. But the question whether a long period analysis of output is or is not possible is that whether that trend is the trend of output is or is not explicable in principle. And according to Garegnani, there is no reason why economic phenomena involving changes in aggregate productive equipment should be any less explicable than those that do not. But as regards productive capacity, the meaning of long run cannot but be partly different when used in connection with a theory of aggregate output than when it is used for a theory of prices. In the latter case, what it is relevant is the lack of congruence between relative capacity and relative demand in the several industries. Whereas what is relevant for a theory of aggregate output is the lack of congruence between aggregate capacity and aggregate demand. And this point is relevant because it explains why, according to Garegnani, you can separate long-run output and price determination, and because it explains why he remains open to the possibility that the tendency of capacity to adjust to demand does not necessarily mean that normal utilization of capacity is a condition to be presupposed in an analysis of the long-run output of the economy. But how can aggregate demand shape the trend of capital accumulation? Garegnani refers to the two-sided nature of investment determining demand and determining the growth of capacity. Specifically, capital accumulation and with it the output trend will be affected, according to Garegnani, by the state of long-term expectations regarding final demand, that is the autonomous component of aggregate demand that do not generate productive capacity. And since the normal degree of capacity utilization is lower than 1, changes in these components of aggregate demand can generate changes in output through immediate changes in capacity utilization, which led in turn to the creation and destruction of capacity through higher or lower flows of investment. Following this route, with an equation formally equivalent to that of Arnold, Garegnani argues that the elasticity of output is even higher in the long run than in the short run, thanks precisely to the creation or destruction of productive capacity. If we now go on to analyze Garegnani's suggestions regarding income distribution, he follows Straffa in distinguishes a subsistence and surplus wage, clarifying that both an explanation of the changes in the surplus wage along the lines of the classical economist Marx and a determination of it as a residuum along those of Straffa's suggestion of a rate of profits susceptible of being determined by the level of the money rate of interest are compatible with the analytical structure of the surplus approach. And it can be interesting to stress that Garegnani also contributed to tracing the roots of Straffa's suggestion to take as given the rate of profits in his price system in the ideas of Keynes on the rate of interest as a monetary phenomenon. As Garegnani wrote, given the wage profit curve, Keynes' suggestions that the average level of the rate of interest on long-term loans will be determined by conventional factors, ultimately subject to the policy of the monetary authorities, would suffice to constitute the nucleus of the theory of distribution. Indeed, it seems reasonable to suppose that as a result of competition in product markets, the average rate of profit and the average rate of interest on long-term loans will tend over a sufficiently long period of time to move in step with one another. If then the rate of interest depends on the policy of the monetary authorities, both the long-term movement of the average rate of profits and through the relation just mentioned, that of the real wages, are explained by that policy. Of course, according to Garegnani, this monetary determination of distribution does not entail maintaining afresh that the wage bargaining has no power to change real wages, because now I'm quoting again Garegnani, the policy of the monetary authorities is not conducted in a vacuum, and the movement of prices and the money wages determined in the wage bargaining will be amongst the most important considerations in the formulation of the policy. And indeed, Garegnani's idea is in this respect that distribution will be the final result of the interaction between the policy of the monetary authorities shaping the nominal rate of interest and the action of the trade unions in wage bargaining.
Please, Sergio, try to conclude. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, this closure of Straffa's price system alone is alternative to that advanced by Calder and John Robinson, according to which the rate of profits is determined by the rate of accumulation on the basis of the Cambridge equation. And this idea of Calder and John Robinson as stems from the idea that in the long run, the adjustment of savings per unit of capital to the rate of accumulation can be achieved only by means of a change in income distribution to profits. And this assumes an inflexibility of the levels of output to changes in the rates of investment, which Garegnani refuted by arguing that the elasticity of output to aggregate demand, as we have seen, can in the long run be even greater than in the short run, due to changes in the size of productive capacity. Unit capital to the rate of accumulation can be achieved only by means of a change. And this assumes an inflexibility.
Okay.
And following this argument, Garegnani denies any explicative content to the Cambridge equation with respect to determination of income distribution. And I want only do this final remark. The fact is that if the Cambridge equation is satisfied by a discrepancy between the actual and the desired or normal degree of capacity utilization, the rate of profits which will appear in the equation will be the ratio of the realized profits to the stock of capital, which can have different values without any change in the normal rate of profit. That is the rate calculated on the basis of a normal degree of capacity utilization. And according to Garegnani, it is this rate calculated on the basis of the normal degree of capacity utilization that it is relevant in the theory of distribution, since it is the rate that will be expected when entrepreneurs will do gross investment. A last remark, perhaps by accident, in an introduction of a recent book in honor of Lavoie and Seccareccia, Garegnani is labeled as a minor economist. As this presentation, I hope, has shown, is indeed a scholar who gave fundamental contribution for the reconstruction of economic theory along lines different from the neoclassical ones. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you, Sergio.
You told me that I would have 30 minutes, so
yes, but we consume some time. But the kindness of organizers has allowed us 5 minutes more, so that if there are questions or clarifications from the floor, Sergio will be glad to answer.
I am checking our YouTube channel. If there is any question, I will ask. Okay. I am checking now our YouTube channel.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Let's wait a few seconds, please, because there is a time difference between Zoom and YouTube.
Yes.
Is there any question? Let me see.
No
yes.
question.
Thank you very much for your participation and support. There is no question.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sergio. Can we stay in the same room now?
Yeah, we can continue by Francini.